612 surveillance logs. That is what an analyst inside the Joint Intelligence Cell at Thiepval Barracks in Lisburn had compiled on a single target over the course of 6 months. 6 months of telephone intercepts, of static observation posts manned in freezing rain on the South Armagh border, of blurred photographs taken through long lenses from unmarked cars parked on roads where the IRA could identify a foreign vehicle by the mud pattern on the wheel arches. 6 months of signals intelligence, of human source reports filed and cross-referenced and mapped onto a chart that covered an entire wall of a room where the lights never went off. 612 entries in a log that represented the most resource-intensive surveillance operation running in the province at that moment. The problem was introduced in a single sentence, spoken quietly, by a captain from 22 SAS who had been on the ground in South Armagh for 11 months. He said it without raising his voice. He said it without theatrics. He looked at the chart on the wall, looked at the analyst, and said something that stripped 6 months of institutional effort down to its foundation and found the foundation rotten. Your intelligence is 3 weeks out of date, not slightly outdated, not missing some peripheral detail that could be filled in later. 3 weeks out of date on the core question of who the target actually was. The man at the center of 612 surveillance logs, the man the cell had been identifying, tracking, photographing, and building a prosecution package around for half a year, was not the person they believed him to be. He was not an IRA operative. He was not running weapons, not coordinating active service units, not providing the logistical chain that connected the South Armagh Brigade to its bomb-making networks. He was a man who had done those things once for a period that had ended before the surveillance operation had begun, and who had since been moved sideways by the IRA's own internal restructuring in a way that the desk analysts had not detected because their sources had stopped being reliable at exactly the moment the IRA had changed its cellular structure. The real target, the man who had inherited the network the cell had been watching, had been operating undisturbed for 3 months. He had been on the ground the whole time, moving through the same streets, using some of the same locations, but running an entirely different operation with a different set of people. And nobody in the intelligence cell had noticed the switch because the switch had been deliberately obscured by the IRA using exactly the counter-surveillance techniques they had spent a decade learning from watching how British intelligence worked. What happened in that room at Thiepval when the SAS captain made his assessment is a compressed version of the central problem that defined intelligence operations in Northern Ireland for 30 years. It is a story about what happens when the distance between a surveillance photograph and the ground it depicts is measured not in miles, but in weeks. It is a story about the difference between what a database tells you and what a man who has been living inside a community for the better part of a year can see with his own eyes. And it is a story about the peculiar and under-examined role of American intelligence in a conflict that most people in Washington understood the way you understand a country from an airport layover. To understand how that room reached that moment, you have to go back to the beginning of the intelligence war. Not the shooting war, which has its own brutal chronology. The intelligence war, which was older, quieter, and in many ways more consequential. The Troubles, the euphemism that Northern Ireland's 30-year conflict earned for itself, began formally in 1968 as a civil rights movement and devolved within 2 years into a sustained armed campaign by the Provisional Irish Republican Army against British military and police presence in the province. After 29 years and over 3,700 deaths, the Good Friday Agreement ended the Northern Ireland conflict in 1998. But during those decades, the province became arguably the most intensively surveilled piece of territory in the Western world. Not because of its size, which was tiny, not because of its population, which was barely 1.5 million, but because the nature of the conflict made intelligence the primary battlefield in a way that almost no other modern conflict had demonstrated so completely. London's poor intelligence picture of Northern Ireland in the late 1960s and early 1970s is readily clear in now declassified Joint Intelligence Committee deliberations. The British security apparatus arrived in the province in 1969 and 1970 almost blind. The Royal Ulster Constabulary's Special Branch had been tracking Republican and Loyalist extremists for decades, but their picture of the new Provisional IRA, a movement that had split from the older official IRA in December 1969, was incomplete and frequently wrong. The first attempts to fill the gap were disastrous. A clandestine 40-member military reaction force unit operated in Irish Catholic parts of Belfast from 1971 to 1973, the deadliest years of conflict. The MRF, as it became known, was a British Army covert unit that ran undercover operations in civilian clothes in nationalist areas, and it produced a series of incidents, shootings, surveillance compromises, operational failures that generated enough political damage to force a complete restructuring. The MRF operated with insufficient intelligence from RUC Special Branch, or MI5, and a BBC Panorama investigation found the unit was linked to 10 shootings of unarmed civilians. The Four Square Laundry, a front operation designed to collect intelligence from nationalist areas under the cover of a laundry collection service, was blown by IRA counterintelligence and shut down in a lethal ambush in 1972. Following a series of controversial incidents involving the Mobile Reconnaissance Force, the SAS were tasked with setting up a new undercover unit for surveillance operations in Northern Ireland, which became known as 14 Intelligence Company, or the DET. The DET was a different creature from anything that had come before it. With around 120 operators, both men and women, from all branches of the military, it split into 4 detachments, each with its slice of the province's toughest areas: Antrim, Londonderry, Belfast, and Newry. They ran plainclothes covert surveillance, bugging, reconnaissance, and sometimes direct action operations. Members of the unit were recruited from regular Army battalions and trained in an 8-week course by the Special Air Service. The selection weeded out anyone who could not disappear into a civilian environment and stay there under pressure. Northern Ireland's homogeneous communities, where driving through a particular neighborhood twice in a day could be suicidal, required something beyond conventional soldiering. The DET operators had to be actors as much as soldiers. They had to hold cover stories under questioning from people who knew their neighborhood's rhythms intimately, who could tell by the way you held your shopping bag whether you belonged on a particular street. But the DET was not the only organization in the field, and this was where the intelligence picture began to develop its structural fractures. The coordinating officer, Sir Maurice Oldfield, oversaw the activity of MI6, MI5, 14 Intelligence Company, the SAS, the Force Research Unit, RUC Special Branch, RUC Special Patrol Group Bronze Section, and the Special Military Intelligence Unit. 7 distinct intelligence organizations, each with its own chain of command, its own sources, its own methods, and its own institutional motivations, all operating in a province roughly the size of Yorkshire. The danger that Maurice Oldfield had been appointed to manage was real and specific. As the conflict in Northern Ireland escalated, so did the number of British security and intelligence organizations operating clandestinely throughout the island of Ireland. So much so, there was a real danger of British spooks bumping unknowingly into other British spooks, with potentially tragic results. Add to this the Force Research Unit, which was established in 1980 during the Troubles to obtain intelligence from terrorist organizations in Northern Ireland by recruiting and running agents and informants. The FRU operated out of Thiepval Barracks in Lisburn, running human agents inside the IRA and loyalist groups simultaneously. Based at British Army HQ in Lisburn, the FRU was established to allow centralized control and tasking of military agents intended to complement the work of existing intelligence-gathering agencies by recruiting human assets, with among its main aims penetrating paramilitary groups. The central problem was compartmentalization taken to its logical and self-defeating extreme. Each organization protected its sources so fiercely from the others that the organizations frequently did not know what the others knew. Whether close target or long target, surveillance operations were often reactionary, a response to an MI5 or special branch tip. But what the tip giver knew and what the tip receiver needed to know were not always the same thing, and the gap between them could kill people. A serving MI5 officer recommended that arrests of terror suspects must be cleared with special branch in advance to ensure they were not state agents. That single operational requirement, check before you move because the men you are about to arrest might be ours, tells you everything about the complexity of the environment. You could build a 6-month surveillance operation around a target and then, at the moment of action, discover that the person you had spent 6 months watching was simultaneously an asset of an entirely different organization that had not told you. The IRA understood this complexity and learned to exploit it. The IRA was highly compartmentalized, working in small 4-person active service units, or ASUs. By the mid-1980s, the provisional IRA had restructured itself precisely to limit the damage that any single informer or surveillance compromise could do. Rather than the old battalion structure, which had made it possible for a single well-placed agent to map an entire regional organization, the IRA moved to a cell system where ASU members frequently did not know the identities of people in other ASUs. They changed safe houses regularly. They changed vehicles. They changed communication patterns. The increased practice of jarking, electronically bugging, and disabling weapons, but leaving them in place, represented one British countermeasure. But jarking required you to know where the weapons were, and knowing where the weapons were required you to know who was moving them. And knowing who was moving them required the kind of ground-level human intelligence that the IRA's cellular structure was specifically designed to prevent. In South Armagh, all of this reached its most extreme expression. South Armagh became a zone where the movement of British troops by road had become almost impossible. Heavily armored vehicles such as Ferrets and Saracens had patrolled the roads in the early years, but they offered little long-term protection, and by the mid-1980s, the British Army had effectively abandoned the road network altogether. This was not rhetorical. Helicopters became the only safe way to resupply British bases in the area. The IRA's South Armagh Brigade had turned the physical geography of the border region into a denial zone. The McMahon Road Barracks in Portadown and Drumad Barracks in Armagh were busy centers for intelligence gatherers charged with infiltrating provisional IRA operations in South Armagh. Bugging devices and hidden cameras were frequently uncovered by the IRA's counterintelligence units during the 1980s and 1990s in South Armagh. It was into this environment that American intelligence had a presence, though characteristically smaller and more circumspect than the enormous footprint it maintained elsewhere in the world. The CIA's presence in Ireland has been described as minimal, with the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Agency having a more significant presence. The CIA's interest in the Northern Ireland conflict was primarily strategic. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, the Provisional IRA had maintained links with the Palestine Liberation Organization, with Libyan intelligence under Muammar Gaddafi, and with left-wing European terrorist organizations. All of this fell within the CIA's counterterrorism mandate, and all of it generated intelligence requirements that the agency attempted to service through liaison relationships with British intelligence rather than through independent operations. The liaison relationship was not always harmonious. British intelligence organizations, and particularly MI5, maintained a deeply protective attitude toward their operational security in Northern Ireland that made them reluctant to share the granular details of ongoing operations with American counterparts. The Americans, for their part, brought their own institutional habits, a preference for technical intelligence over human intelligence, a tendency to overclassify and undercontextualize, and a bureaucratic confidence in the reliability of signals intelligence that Northern Ireland's environment consistently undermined. The IRA had learned, through bitter experience and through informers inside the British security apparatus itself, which communication methods triggered electronic surveillance. They adjusted. The adjustments were not always immediate, but over time the operational security of IRA active service units in South Armagh approached a standard that made signals intelligence, by itself, an unreliable guide to current activity. What American intelligence analysts working on Northern Ireland from their desk positions, whether in Washington or from liaison postings in London, consistently encountered was the problem of lag. Intelligence about IRA organization, personnel, and operational patterns was accurate as of the moment it was collected. The collection might have occurred 6 weeks ago. The dissemination might have occurred 4 weeks ago. The analysis might have occurred 2 weeks ago. The briefing might be happening now. Between the moment of collection and the moment of operational action, 3 weeks could pass in the most efficient system. In Northern Ireland, 3 weeks was enough time for the IRA to rotate personnel, change a cell's operational focus, move a weapons cache, or replace an ASU commander who had begun to attract surveillance attention with someone else who had not yet come to notice. This was the precise mechanism behind the misidentification problem at the center of the incident that took place in that room at Thiepval. The details of the specific operation remain classified. What can be reconstructed from the established pattern of intelligence failures documented in declassified and public sources is the anatomy of how such failures occurred and why an SAS captain with 11 months on the ground was positioned to see something that 612 surveillance log entries had concealed from everyone else in the room. The SAS troop deployed to Northern Ireland in the early 1980s underwent a significant structural change from the earlier squadron rotations. Rather than an entire squadron, a smaller troop of around 20 SAS men would deploy for year-long tours. They were organized, along with 14 intelligence, under the umbrella command of the Intelligence and Security Group in Northern Ireland. The longer tours meant that the SAS men could acquire better local knowledge than those who were in the EU. 6-month squadron rotation. That shift from 6 months to a year mattered enormously. 6 months in South Armagh was enough time to begin learning the ground. 12 months was enough time to actually know it. An SAS captain with a 12-month tour was not working from briefing documents. He was working from pattern recognition built through thousands of hours of observation, movement, and interaction with the physical and social environment of a specific area. He knew which farms had changed their gait patterns in the last month. He knew which vehicles had stopped appearing on which roads. He knew because he had watched it happen through a long lens from a hedgerow at 4 a.m. that the man identified in the surveillance logs as the primary target had not left his house before midnight in 8 weeks. While someone else, someone not in the surveillance logs at all, had begun using the route the primary target had used previously, at the same times of night, driving with the same counter-surveillance techniques. The distinction between those two observations sounds straightforward when written out. It was not straightforward in practice. The IRA's counter-surveillance awareness by the mid-1980s had reached a level that the organization had evolved into a tightly coordinated guerrilla force, especially in strongholds like South Armagh, where operations were disciplined, intelligence-led, and grounded in intimate local knowledge. Part of that evolution was a deliberate practice of having the previous holder of a role continue using some of the same physical infrastructure during the transition period, specifically to deceive surveillance operations that might be tracking patterns rather than individuals. The approach assumed correctly that a surveillance team working from a large distance and relying on vehicle signatures, route patterns, and communications metadata would not necessarily distinguish between a change of personnel if the physical signatures were preserved. What broke the deception was not technical intelligence. It was a man walking through the same ground for 11 months and noticing a detail that no camera could have captured and no database could have predicted. The new occupant of the role drove differently. Not dangerously, not in a way that would attract attention from a road checkpoint. But at night, approaching a specific junction in a specific village, the previous target had always slowed to look right before turning left. Every time, for months on the surveillance footage, the brake lights came on 10 meters earlier than the road surface required. It was a personal habit, probably unconscious, probably dating from some earlier experience at that junction. The new man did not do it. He drove through the junction without checking right, because he did not know what was around the corner to the right. He had not yet learned the ground. An SAS captain noticed this. He noticed it because he had watched the junction himself on multiple occasions, and the brake light pattern was something he had mentally logged without understanding its significance until the pattern changed. The change happened during his 10th month in the province. It took him 3 weeks of additional observation to confirm it. By the time he brought the assessment to the intelligence cell at Thiepval, he had constructed a parallel picture of the new cell structure from scratch, using nothing but observation, movement analysis, and the kind of patient accumulation of ground-level detail that cannot be formalized into a collection requirement or tasked to a technical asset. The confrontation in the intelligence cell was not dramatic in the way that confrontations are dramatic in films. There was no shouting. There was no moment where an analyst was forced to publicly accept defeat. What there was, instead, was a long silence during which the captain's assessment was checked against the existing logs and during which the gaps in the logs became visible in a way they had not been before. The surveillance photographs showed the target's vehicle in locations consistent with operational activity. The captain's observation notes showed a different vehicle at the same locations, at times when the primary target's vehicle had not been there. The photographs had been interpreted as confirmation of the primary target's continued activity. They were actually showing someone else using the same locations. The American intelligence liaison officer present at this meeting, whose role is confirmed by the documented pattern of CIA and FBI liaison to British intelligence organizations during this period, received the briefing as a challenge to a 6-month analytical effort that had been built in part on intelligence products disseminated through the liaison channel. The products had been accurate when generated. They reflected what was genuinely known at the time of collection. The problem was not bad analysis. The problem was the 3-week lag built into every step of the intelligence chain between the moment of collection and the moment of operational decision, multiplied by the 6 months the operation had been running, producing a picture that was internally consistent and utterly detached from current reality. The phrase that made its way into the informal record of that meeting, "Your intelligence is 3 weeks out of date," was not a condemnation of the analysts who had built the picture. It was an assessment of a structural problem that no analyst working from a desk could solve, and that no technical collection system could prevent. The only corrective to a 3-week lag in a target environment that changed on a daily basis was a human being on the ground who had been there long enough to see the changes in real time. Not a sensor, not a database. A person walking the same roads, watching the same junctions in all weather for a year. The broader context of this intelligence failure illuminates something specific about how American intelligence engaged with Northern Ireland that generated institutional friction throughout the conflict. The Americans brought enormous technical capability. The NSA's SIGINT coverage of IRA communications was real, comprehensive within its technical limits, and periodically decisive. Irish military intelligence worked closely with the British Security Service, MI5, the Secret Intelligence Service, and the American Central Intelligence Agency. The sharing of signals intelligence through what was effectively an extension of the Five Eyes architecture provided British intelligence with useful data points on IRA external relationships, on arms procurement from Libya, on the movement of money through American Irish Republican support networks. The Irish Northern Aid Committee, known as NORAID, had been a subject of FBI investigation since the early 1970s, and American law enforcement's interest in the transatlantic support structure for the IRA generated intelligence that genuinely contributed to the British picture. But technical intelligence, even excellent technical intelligence, had a ceiling in Northern Ireland that the Americans found harder to accept than the British did. The IRA's most operationally significant communications did not happen on monitored telephone lines. They happened face-to-face between people who had known each other for decades, in living rooms and farm-out buildings and the backs of vehicles, in a community so tightly woven that everyone knew everyone else's business and the presence of any outsider was detectable within minutes. No satellite could access those conversations. No telephone intercept could record what was said between two men sitting in a field at night. The only intelligence that could penetrate those conversations was human intelligence, and human intelligence in South Armagh required the kind of immersion that the British had been developing, painfully and at significant cost, since 1972. The cost had been enormous. In May 1980, when an IRA team were cornered in a Belfast residential neighborhood, an SAS unit stormed the wrong house, and SAS Captain Richard Westmacott was killed as his team exited their vehicle. The intelligence that had directed that team to the wrong house was not bad intelligence in the abstract. It was intelligence that had been accurate when collected and had ceased to be accurate by the time the operation executed. The same structural problem, repeated in a different context, with a lethal result. The joint British Army and RUC operation at Loughgall was codenamed Operation Judy, and it was the IRA's biggest loss of life in a single incident during the Troubles. The British Army and RUC had received detailed intelligence about the IRA's plans and had been waiting in hidden positions. The intelligence that made Loughgall possible was not primarily signals intelligence. It was the product of a monitored telephone call, of an informer's report, of months of ground-level surveillance that had tracked the East Tyrone Brigade's pattern of operations well enough to anticipate their methodology before they acted. In a monitored telephone call, an IRA volunteer indiscreetly told his girlfriend about the plan for Loughgall. One careless conversation, monitored because the network around the target had been compromised by patient, long-term human intelligence work, broke open an operation that all the signals intelligence in the world had not surfaced. At Loughgall, the SAS wiped out 2 entire ASUs, a large part of the highly effective East Tyrone Brigade, in a single engagement. The lesson that the SAS captain's assessment carried out of that room at Thiepval was not simply that a single intelligence picture had gone stale. It was that the intelligence architecture being applied to Northern Ireland contained a fundamental and irreducible tension between the bureaucratic requirement for a documented, sourced, cross-referenced intelligence product and the operational requirement for a current understanding of a target environment that changed faster than any bureaucratic process could follow. The documented product was essential for legal purposes, for authorizing operations, for protecting sources, for the chain of accountability that the rule of law demanded even in the middle of a low-intensity war. But the documented product, by the time it reached an operational cell, was already a historical document. It described the past. Operations were conducted in the present. The SAS captain's value was not that he was smarter than the analysts. It was that his intelligence gathering was continuous and synchronous with the environment he was observing. He did not collect, then process, then disseminate, then analyze, then brief. He observed, integrated, and updated in real time inside the environment, with no lag at all between the moment of observation and the moment of operational knowledge. That capacity, The capacity for synchronous intelligence, for a picture that was current to the last hour rather than the last month, was not replicable by any technical system operating in the 1980s, and it was not replicable by any analyst working outside the environment. The implications extended beyond Northern Ireland. The documented pattern of the British intelligence community's operational difficulties in the province, the compartmentalization failures, the source protection conflicts, the technical versus human intelligence tensions, the catastrophic costs of acting on outdated pictures, formed the institutional substrate from which the SAS's later methodology in Iraq and Afghanistan was drawn. The lesson learned in South Armagh, that ground truth is only true at the moment it is observed and decays exponentially thereafter, became the philosophical foundation for the compressed intelligence-to-action cycles that would define British Special Forces operations 20 years later. The American intelligence community drew its own conclusions from its liaison experience in Northern Ireland, though more slowly and with more institutional resistance. The CIA's analytical culture, built around the production of finished intelligence products subjected to rigorous sourcing and review, was not designed to operate at the tempo that Northern Ireland demanded. Many authors suggested that alongside other factors, British intelligence helped force the IRA into peace, but despite growing evidence emerging about British intelligence successes and failures against the IRA, there was no extensive study of the intelligence war against the IRA. That absence of rigorous post-analysis was itself revealing. The intelligence war in Northern Ireland was too complex, too politically sensitive, and too institutionally inconvenient to subject to the kind of objective after-action review that military operations routinely received. What was not contested in any forum where the people who had actually worked the problem were present was the specific competence the SAS brought to an environment where human intelligence and ground truth were the only currencies that reliably purchased accurate pictures. When it came to longer operations, some lasted for years. The need to retain knowledge of a specific person or group contrasted with the need to rotate operators. The SAS's year-long tours in Northern Ireland extended from the earlier 6-month rotations precisely because of the demonstrated value of accumulated local knowledge, were an institutional acknowledgement that in this environment, longevity was a force multiplier. A man who had been watching the same ground for 12 months was not twice as effective as a man who had been watching it for 6. He was qualitatively different, operating with a depth of pattern recognition that could not be compressed into a shorter tour or supplemented by any quantity of technical collection. The SAS captain who said that 612 surveillance log entries were 3 weeks out of date was not making a claim about technical competence or analytical capability. He was making a claim about something simpler and more fundamental. He was making a claim about what it means to know a place, not to have data about a place, not to have a model of a place, to know it in the way that the farmers and the shopkeepers and the mechanics of South Armagh knew it by having been present in it continuously through enough cycles of routine and deviation to recognize when something has changed and what that change means. That knowledge could not be generated at a desk in Washington. It could not be generated in a liaison briefing in London. It could not be extracted from a database or a satellite feed or a monitoring log. It could only be generated by putting a man in the ground and keeping him there until the ground became part of him, until the brake lights at a junction in the dark registered as something more than a data point, until they registered as wrong, and the wrongness sent him back across the fields to document what he had seen before the information decayed. The confrontation at Thiepval did not resolve any of the systemic problems that had created it. The compartmentalization continued. The jurisdictional disputes between MI5, the FRU, RUC Special Branch, and the military intelligence organizations continued. The intelligence war between the IRA and the UK government ended in something resembling a stalemate. The institutional friction between British and American intelligence perspectives on Northern Ireland continued until the Good Friday Agreement made the question largely academic. What the confrontation produced was a corrected operational picture, a revised surveillance plan built around the actual current cell structure rather than the one that had existed 6 months earlier, and a successful operation against the correct target that would not have happened without the SAS captain's observation. The outcome justified the argument. The argument justified the method. And the method, stripped of its Northern Irish specifics and redeployed across the decades into the very different but structurally similar environments of Iraq and Afghanistan, became one of the most durable operational principles the British Special Forces community ever codified. The intelligence is always out of date. The only question is how far out of date you are willing to tolerate before you put a man in the ground to correct it. In Northern Ireland, the answer to that question was learned the hard way, by organizations that paid for their institutional delays with lives on both sides of the wire, in farmyards and on country roads, and in housing estates where the IRA knew the ground as well as the SAS was learning to know it, and had been learning it for considerably longer. After 29 years and over 3,700 deaths, both sides' intelligence apparatus had reached a point of mutual exhaustion, mutual penetration, and mutual recognition that the war could not be won by either side through intelligence alone. But in that room at Thiep Val, for one operational cycle, a captain from 22 SAS closed the lag to 0. He looked at 612 entries in a surveillance log that represented the best intelligence product a consortium of organizations could produce, and told the room, flatly and without apology, that the best was not good enough, that the ground had moved on, that the picture was wrong, and that the only way to make it right was to go back out into the dark and look at the junction again, because the man at the desk could not see what the man at the hedge could see, and no amount of intelligence product would bridge the distance between those two positions. The man at the hedge was always going to know more. That was the lesson Northern Ireland taught the British Special Forces. That was the lesson that made a CIA liaison officer in a room in Lisburn go quiet when an SAS captain told him his intelligence was 3 weeks out of date. Not because the statement was an insult, because it was the most operationally significant truth in the building, and the one most resistant to the institutional processes that were supposed to prevent it. 3 weeks, 6 months, 612 entries. And one man who had been watching a junction at night long enough to notice when something changed.